This is the brand new Sony a7C Mark II, and this is the kinda brand new Sony ZV-E1. And in today's video, we're gonna compare some of the key differences between these two compact full-frame cameras and see which one's right for you. They both cost $2,200 and they're both tiny powerhouses, but critically, they serve two different purposes. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. Starting off, let's look at the physical differences between these two cameras. Both of these cameras are super compact full-frame sensor cameras with a lot of physical similarities. They have the same I/O ports, including a 3.5mm microphone port, a USB-C data and charging port, a single UHS-2 capable SD card slot, a micro HDMI port, and a 3.5mm headphone port. They both feature a multi-interface hot shoe mount. Both cameras utilize 5-axis in-body image stabilization. They have the same articulating LCD touchscreen with a 1,000,000 dot display. They even have 11 custom function buttons. But there are definitely differences, other than the fact that the a7C Mark II has two color variants. The a7C Mark II also has two more dials than the ZV-E1, one on the back and one on the front, which makes it possible to quickly and easily adjust things like shutter speed, aperture, and exposure value. It also has mode dials right on top where the ZV-E1 doesn't. Granted, the ZV-E1 does have a brand new microphone capsule array that records better sounding in-camera audio, though I'm always using an external microphone, so that's not something I found to be a huge feature that spoke to me. But there is actually one major difference between these two cameras. The a7C Mark II has a viewfinder and the ZV-E1 doesn't. More physical features and definitely a viewfinder are things I would rather have than not, especially if I'm doing photo work. So the first point is gonna have to go to the a7C Mark II. Speaking of photo work, let's talk about the key differences between these two cameras when it comes to photography. The first major difference is gonna be that the a7C Mark II has a 33 megapixel sensor, while the ZV-E1 has a 12.9 megapixel sensor. While 12.9 megapixel photos are more than sufficient for posting to social media, the extra detail you're gonna get out of a 33 megapixel photo is gonna be so much more useful for finer detail editing, having room to crop in, and for printing larger photos. Another important distinction between the ZV-E1 and the a7C Mark II is going to be the fact that the a7C Mark II has a mechanical shutter and an electronic shutter, while the ZV-E1 only has an electronic shutter. A mechanical shutter is preferred to help against things like banding when it comes to LED or fluorescent lighting, as well as preventing rolling shutter issues in photos. One place they're equally matched though is how many photos you can take with each camera per second. In continuous shooting mode, shooting at high plus speed, you can get up to 10 frames per second on both cameras. While the ZV-E1 is fine for photos if you don't take that many photos and you want to use it in a pinch to, grab a quick memory or grab a photo for social media, I would much rather use something like the a7C Mark II when it comes to dedicated photo work, especially because of the fact that the a7C Mark II has that 33 megapixel sensor and has that viewfinder. Now, when it comes to videos, both cameras can shoot at 4K 10-bit 422, which means both cameras can fully take advantage of Sony's S-Log3 log picture profile. And while both cameras can shoot 4K 24 frames per second, 30 frames per second, if you want to shoot 4K 60 frames per second on the a7C Mark II, you're going to get a 20% crop. On top of that, the a7C Mark II is going to have significantly worse rolling shutter, that jelloification of straight lines moving really fast across your screen, whether that's because, let's say it's a really fast car driving by, or if it's just because you're doing a really fast whip pan. So for people who are shooting videos primarily, I'm gonna have to give the point to the ZV-E1. Now, on the note of frames per second, the Sony a7C Mark II, like I said, can shoot at 4K 60 frames per second with a 20% crop. And in S&Q mode, you can also shoot at 1080p up to 120 frames per second. But if slow motion footage is something you're really going after, then the ZV-E1 is going to be the better choice, considering that it can shoot at 4K 120 frames per second, and you can shoot at 1080p 240 frames per second in S&Q mode. Now, this next one is kind of interesting. We're going to be talking about USB streaming. Both of these cameras can very easily be used for USB streaming by just using the USB-C port. Whether you're streaming on Twitch or you're just hopping into a call on Zoom, having a camera like either of these two is going to significantly improve the look of your video over your traditional webcam. Both of them have the option to stream in 720p, 1080p, and 4K. But there is a clear winner in this category, and unfortunately, it's not going to be the ZV-E1. Now, the theory is that USB-C streaming causes overheating is because not not only is the camera on the entire time, the USB-C port is also charging the camera while you're using it. Now, there are workarounds. You could turn off USB-C charging so it doesn't heat up the camera, but then the camera battery is going to start draining as you live stream, and at some point you're going to run out of battery. So then you need to use something like a dummy battery plugged into the wall. Or alternatively, you can use an external fan to keep the system cool while USB-C charging. But you can see how this is getting a little bit convoluted and a little bit complicated for something as simple as using it as a webcam. And the a7C Mark II doesn't have this issue. I tested it using it as a webcam with USB-C charging turned on, and I just left it going for like 5 hours, and when I came back to my computer, the camera was still fine, it was still on. Yes, it was warm to the touch, but it never overheated. So if you're looking to use one of these cameras for streaming, the point's gonna go towards the a7C Mark II. Speaking of overheating, I want to reiterate the fact that there's a ton of outrage and fear out there about the ZV-E1 and overheating, and it's based in both fear and fact. Like I said, my ZV-E1 really never overheats on me because I know exactly what I'm using it for. I'm using it to shoot things like highlights of events or segments of a wedding, getting B-roll or product shots for my YouTube videos, or filming things like these talking head segments. And what they all have in common is I'm recording for either 1 to 3 minutes at a time, or at most I'm recording a 20 to 30 minute talking head clip like this. But you know what I won't do? I won't be using my ZV-E1 to film a 30 minutes to an hour long wedding ceremony in the bright hot sun. Nor would I use it as my main camera for an interview session where I'm shooting 5 different interviews back to back over the course of 4 hours. Because I know for a fact that doing that is gonna build up a lot of heat in the system, and at some point I'm gonna risk overheating, and if it's for a client job, then I'm not gonna risk that, and I'd rather bring a different camera like my a7S Mark III or the a7C Mark II. Again, if you know what you're doing with the ZV-E1, it's not gonna overheat on you. But if you never wanna be afraid of overheating unless you're in like a 100-degree oven, then I would go ahead and pick the a7C Mark II. Next up, we're gonna talk about low light performance. And you know that when we talk about low light, I'm gonna be picking the little brother of the a7S Mark III over the little brother of the a7 Mark IV any day of the week. While they both have dual native ISOs, with the a7C Mark II in S-Log3 being at ISO 800 and then cleaning up again at ISO 3200, the ZV-E1 has a native ISO of 640 and then cleaning up again significantly at 12,800. On top of that, if you're really just needing to capture an exposed image, even if it doesn't look that great, the a7C Mark II maxes out at ISO 102,400, while the ZV-E1 maxes out at ISO 409,600, which is an entire 2 extra stops of light. But if I'm gonna be honest here, overall, both cameras perform really well in low light, but if you wanna pick a winner, it's gonna have to be the ZV-E1. All right, and lastly, I wanna talk about stabilization. I think it's important to call out that the a7C Mark II is much more of a hybrid camera than the ZV-E1, which means it does photo and video really, really well, but it lacks some of the very video-centric features that the ZV-E1 has. And in this case, we're talking about the brand new dynamic active stabilization mode that comes in the ZV-E1, which is extremely useful for anybody who shoots a lot of handheld shots. Whether you're talking about self-filming like vlogging, or if you're the one that's going to be behind the camera to shoot other people, having that additional level of stabilization built right into the camera, making panning and following shots much easier handheld, is something that you're not going to be able to get in the a7C Mark II. So at the end of the day, which camera is right for you? Those are the key differences between these two cameras, and you might have noticed that more than 2/3 of the points I talked about today were video-centric, and that's for good reason. If you're a hybrid shooter and 75% or more of your work is based on stills photography, then the a7C Mark II is going to be hands down the better choice. I think the higher megapixel count, giving you the versatility when it comes to cropping After Effects, having more details when it comes to editing, and the ability to print larger, paired with the fact that it has a viewfinder, are non-negotiable for photographers. But when it comes to videos, these two cameras are a lot closer than people would think. The ZV-E1 offers so many more tools for shooting videos, like dynamic active stabilization, 4K 120 frames per second, 1080p 240 frames per second, and much better control over things like rolling shutter. But the biggest issue with the ZV-E1 is the fact that you're gonna have to work around its potential overheating issues. And that prevents it from being an all-around perfect video camera. You can't use it for absolutely every scenario. Meanwhile, the a7C Mark II is about 80% to 90% of the way there when it comes to video features, without the potential problematic overheating issues. Now, I think that the ZV-E1 is still the better option for videographers because of the fact that it is much more unlimited and has a lot more capabilities behind it when it comes to video shooting. But the a7C Mark II is still a great contender as well, and I don't think you're gonna go wrong with either choice. Alright, those are some of the key differences I thought were important enough to mention to you guys, but if you have any other questions for me, let me know in the comment section down below, or better yet, let me know on Discord. I just started a Discord server for photographers, filmmakers, and content creators of all levels to meet other creatives, share your work, and talk about new camera gear. Don't miss out on a chance to be a part of a growing community, and click on the link in the description down below to join. Alright, that's it for this one. If you enjoyed it, hit that like and subscribe button, and if you want to watch more, here's a video that YouTube thought you would really like. And as always, I'll see you in the next one. Peace.